Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. I am finally starting to feel better. I'm so happy about that. Finally went to the doctor, finally got some antibiotics, sounding a little better, so hopefully it won't make you clear your throat here the entire, the interview, I still don't sound great, because I recorded that previous to this portion of editing and uploading, so hopefully the whole interview won't make you clear your throat, but also hopefully it is enjoyable enough that you will not mind my occasional piping in with questions in a scratchy, croaky voice. I have, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode, a returning author with me this episode. Returning author last episode, returning author this episode. This time it is Lorena Hughes, also historical fiction, and also another mystery, different time period, but this one is 1920s, and it is called The Spanish Daughter. Let me go ahead and give you a description of this book. As a child in Spain, Piri always knew her passion for chocolate was inherited from her father. But it's not until his death that she learns of something else she's inherited: a cocoa estate in Vince's Ecuador, a town nicknamed Paris Chiquito. Eager to claim her birthright and filled with hope for a new life after the devastation of World War I, she and her husband Cristobal set out across the Atlantic Ocean. But it soon becomes clear someone is angered by Piri's claim to the estate. When a mercenary sent to murder her aboard the ship accidentally kills Cristobal instead, Piri dons her husband's clothes and assumes his identity, hoping to stay safe while she searches for the truth of her father's legacy in Ecuador. Though freed from the rules that women are expected to follow, Piri confronts other challenges at the estate: newfound siblings, hidden affairs, and her father's dark secrets. Then there are the dangers awakened by her attraction to an enigmatic man as she tries to learn the identity of an enemy who is still at large, threatening the future she's determined to claim. And again, that is The Spanish Daughter by Lorena Hughes. It is got lots of mystery, lots of intrigue. I love the descriptions of Piri taking on the persona of her husband. It's 1920, so it's it's a little bit more modern times, but still not quite the same time that we are living in now, and definitely some more defined gender roles. And she's not used to being a man. She didn't plan this. She goes into this after the accidental killing of her husband, as the description said, and so she's not used to being a man, and she's got a lot to learn about being a man. There's one point that made me giggle when she's sitting in a car just waiting for somebody to open the car door for her, and everybody's looking at her like, what is wrong with you? And she realizes, oh right, she's now a man, not a woman. So that was kind of fun for me. But I love Lorena's attention to detail. The wardrobes in her books are always fascinating. I just get such a vivid image of so many of the characters and what they're wearing, and I got the same with her last book, when This Is Just About Main Street, which she came to talk on the last episode of the podcast, which I should tell you was episode number, let me double check. Wow, it was episode number 38. I did not remember it being that long ago. Wow, so if you're interested in listening to the first episode, it is episode number 38, and you can listen to that wherever you're listening to this episode. But I love her attention to detail, especially with the wardrobe, but also, just attention to detail in general. And I love the complexities of her relationships and the families in her books. They're always so well crafted. So, if you're a fan of historical fiction, if you're a fan of family secrets and intrigue and mystery, then you should definitely check this out. But first, let's listen to the interview and find out more about what went into writing The Spanish Daughter by Lorena Hughes. Hi, Lorena. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you for being here, and I'm excited to talk about your novel, The Spanish Daughter. But before we get to the book, if you could share a little bit about yourself, so either to refresh people's memory or for people who didn't hear the first interview.
Okay. So I was born and raised in Ecuador. I'm from the capital, Quito, where I lived for the first 18 years of my life. I went to the same high school all my life there. And then I came to the United States, to New Mexico, to study fine arts originally at the University of New Mexico. But I also ended up getting a double major with advertising and journalism. And well, my family is half of my family is Palestinian immigrants in Ecuador. And so I have kind of an interesting mix of half Arab, half Ecuadorian. And then I have like one drop of a Chinese great grandfather somewhere in there. So basically, half of my life, I was a visual artist. I studied painting, photography, and then when I graduated, I worked in graphic design and illustration for a newspaper. And then the second half of my life is when I got married to an American and I had kids. And so I started writing, and that's when my next career took off. And I just started writing novels, which originally were meant to be. So one of them, The Sisters of Alameda Street, was meant to be a soap opera, but eventually became a novel in English. And that's where I'm at now, like just writing historical fiction, mysteries, family sagas, that sort of thing.
I could ask you a million questions just about your genealogy. That sounds fascinating. But it gives you, I would assume it gives you plenty of potential fodder for future novels.
Yes. In fact, the sequel to The Spanish Daughter has some new characters, and some of them are a family of Palestinian immigrants in Colombia, where the second novel is set.
Oh, fun. Oh, I'm looking forward to that. So that's a good segue. So can you give an overview of the story for The Spanish Daughter?
Yes. So The Spanish Daughter is the story of a Spanish chocolatier in Sevilla who in 1920 receives news that her father has died in Ecuador and has left her some kind of inheritance. So she's devastated because she hasn't seen her father since she was a toddler, but she's also excited at the prospect of going to Ecuador because she has always wanted to see her father's estate. And so she convinces her husband to sell everything and travel across the Atlantic. But when they do that, someone tries to murder her aboard the ship and ends up killing her husband instead. And so she's obviously terrified, and she sees the only option to continue with her trip to dress up as a man and try to find out who killed her husband and see if she can claim her inheritance. And so when she arrives to Ecuador, she goes to this town called Vinces, which is also known as Little Paris. And she meets half siblings that she didn't even know existed. And so she kind of she stays around to figure out if any of them planned her murder. And that's kind of how the story goes from there.
Okay, so now that you have a little bit more of an introduction to the book, let's go ahead and take our first break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast gives you advice on everything from hair to fashion to skincare products. We'll talk about the latest trends in makeup, hairstyles, and anti-aging remedies. And we'll cover all of the newest fashion trends. If you have an interest in or questions about the beauty trends that might work best for you, the Golden State Media Concepts Beauty Tips Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Beauty Tips Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Lorena Hughes about her historical fiction novel, The Spanish Daughter. Let's return to that interview. And as we return, just a reminder before the break, Lorena was talking about the story and the circumstances under which Puri comes to Ecuador and meets her siblings that she did not know that she had.
It's not the best introduction to new family members because she's pretending to be her dead husband, and she's also not sure if any of them tried to kill her. So they really don't get off to the best start, do they?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, I think she thinks she should be excited, but given the circumstances, she's not. And she thinks the worst of them when she first gets there. And so, yeah, that's kind of how it
What was your initial inspiration for this story?
Well, I wouldn't say it's just one thing, but perhaps the thing that ignited this whole story was when I heard that there was a mini Eiffel Tower somewhere in the coast of Ecuador. And so because I grew up there, but I didn't know this because that was in the coast and I lived in the capital, right? And it was not very well known. So I started researching about it, and I found out that in the late 19th century, a group of French entrepreneurs had bought land in Ecuador and were producing and exporting cacao beans all over the world. And when that happened, Ecuador became the top exporting country in the world of cacao beans for about a decade. And the other interesting thing was that in that little town known as Vinces, they started, there was all this imported goods that were brought in from France, and like artwork and ornaments, and the architecture mimicked some of the Baroque style in Europe. So it was this tiny little their piece of Paris and the tropics. Right. So I found the setting fascinating. That was the first thing that inspired me. And then I thought, okay, I have to set something there because this is really interesting to me. And then I kept researching different things. And somehow I came across the name of a Spanish woman who invented one of the cacao bean roasters in 1847. And her name was María Purificación García. And there is a patent of her invention online. I found it in one of the Spanish government website. And so I was really fascinated by that. And I also I started reading about women inventors, and I found out that many of them had to register their patents under their husbands' names. And that led me to read about women dressing as men to enter fields that were traditionally forbidden to them, such as warfare, medicine, and even literature. And so I had always been fascinated by the trope of cross-dressing in fiction. And so I thought, why not? I'm just going to do this. And that's kind of how the whole thing took shape, because I wanted to combine all those elements. And of course, I wanted to write a mystery because and a family story, because that's the thing I love the most to write about.
I love that. I love that you had several points of interest that you were able to bring together into this story. That's really cool. Can you talk a little bit more about the main character and what about her that you think might resonate with readers?
Sure. So I named her after that lady, the women inventor, María Purificación, Puri for short. So I think that she's a very vulnerable character, because what happens to her is something that I think people can identify with, like people that have gone through trauma, or people, just being the new person somewhere or travel to a new place. She experiences a lot of universal emotions that people go through, fear, and like the desire to find out where do I come from. And I think that she may resonate too, because she's very brave and she's adventurous, but I think she also has a lot of compassion for the people that she starts meeting. So even though she's trying to get information from her, and from the get-go she thinks the worst of a bunch of them, then she starts seeing their humanity, and she's even trying to help them with things. And so she does have a sense of justice. And I don't know, I just love this character. It's one of my favorite characters that I've written.
One thing that I liked initially about her when we first meet her, she wasn't planning on impersonating her husband. That came about kind of suddenly, and she didn't have a lot of forethought into this plan. So she just suddenly is pretending to be a man and realizing all the things she didn't know. And so she's just trying to fit into this world that she's not had to fit into. And so I was fascinated watching her try to personify or become this gender that she was familiar with, but not intimately, not that familiar with.
Yeah, I like that. I think that she goes through two new things. One is a new country and a new family, and the other thing is trying to pretend to be a man. And yeah, she kind of know. That's why I wanted her to be married from the beginning, because you kind of get more knowledge of how men are, or like how the different gender is when you're married. And yet she'd never had stepped on his shoes, so she never knew how people treated him differently, than how they would treat her. So she would, like you said, in 1920, those differences were very huge, so she's noticing all these things as she go about.
Yeah, and in some ways realizing that she has different kinds of freedom as a man than as a woman.
Correct.
In terms of research, obviously you researched, the patent that you found and certain things like that. But what other types of research did you do for the book?
Well, it started with the obvious things. I checked out books, library books about chocolate. The whole process of cacao, from cacao bean to finished product. I interviewed a chocolatier that I found online. I had, of course, I had to research about fashion, transportation, language that wasn't used at the time, the town where my story takes place. So I had to look at maps, read about the history of the place. I read some testimonies of people who have lived there and had seen the transformation after the French left and things like that. I also I went to Guayaquil, which is the first city where she arrives in Ecuador. And it's interesting because they have a historic park there. And I went to see it just as a tourist would. And they had these haciendas, this beautiful hacienda in there. And I looked at it and I said, oh, this would be a great inspiration for the hacienda where the family lives in my story. And I took a bunch of pictures and that's how I described it. And a couple of years later, I found out that is actually a replica of an hacienda in Vinces. So in this exact place of my setting. So I was fascinated with that. Other than that, I saw a lot of YouTube videos about chocolate making, about cockatoos, because you know how I have that cockatoo character. I interviewed a friend of mine who is a priest, so that I can get more insight about what they go through. I also there was a girl in Ecuador when I was a teenager who allegedly saw the Virgin Mary, and so she became a huge thing during those years in Ecuador. And I got a documentary about her and read about her. So anything I could get my hands on, I did.
we are going to take the second break of the podcast, but when we come back, we are going to talk more about that cockatoo character that Lorena referred to. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with Lorena Hughes. We are talking about her historical fiction novel, The Spanish Daughter. We were just talking about characters in the book, and there was a passing reference to the cockatoo character, which we're about to explore further. So let's get back to that interview.
I love that you referred to it as the cockatoo character. Like, this is not just a bird. This is not just a pet. This is a full-on character.
Oh, no. And if you see those cockatoos in YouTube, you'll see what I mean.
Yes.
Because they are divas and they have their own thoughts about things. And if they get upset at their owners if they're late or they leave them alone for too long, and they start yelling at them. They're really cute. So I was a fan. I would watch them nonstop. And I got all my family to watch them too.
I love it. In terms of character development, obviously you had some ideas in terms of Puri's character, in terms, the cross-dressing, the chocolate, the patent, those sorts of things kind of in her backstory. But when you write, do you tend to have a pretty good idea of your characters before you start writing, or do you like to develop them as you write, a combination thereof? How does that work for you?
So I have a basic idea of who the character needs to be in order to do these things, right? So for example, Puri couldn't have been a very mellow, quiet, introverted kind of person to do this. So I knew that she had to be adventurous, that she had to be a little bit different than the women of her times, just so that she would do all those things. So I started thinking in those terms, and then I don't know if you're familiar with the Enneagram.
Yes.
Yeah. So I try to think of what number would this person be, and then I read about their personality types and what would be consistent with this personality type, but that's kind of like my basic. But then really where I think the characters develop and emerge is in my revision, because then I start seeing things that I hadn't seen before. Like with Puri, for example, all these things that you noted about her realizing how different her life is from her husband's or other men, or how other men are different from each other and they're not all the same. All those sort of things came about in revision as I kept going, exploring the themes I was trying to develop, and that's how I see it. And that happens with all the other secondary characters as well. I have a basic understanding of who they might be, but they really come to life in revision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What number is Puri on the Enneagram?
She's a 3.
A 3. Okay, I'm a 6, but I'm not as familiar with some of the other numbers, but so I'll have to look that up and see.
Yeah, it's like a very ambitious type, and
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm a 2 with a 3 wing, so I understand part of her personality, but not quite. I'm not as adventurous as she is.
Me either. Um, and then what draws you to writing historical fiction?
So I love the minutia of, history, of the intricacies of day-to-day life of ordinary people, and how religion and societal norms shape the lives of women in particular. Um, when people ask me why I write historical mysteries or fiction, I tell them that I think it's almost easier than writing contemporary fiction, because the limitations of technology, such as, in transportation, communications, and medicine, for example, bring inherent obstacle to the characters. So I think that history itself can drive the plot. So what I do a lot is I find an obscure setting, or an event that hasn't been really explored, and then I try to think of a question, because like I write mysteries, so I want to think of, well, who tried to kill Puri, that sort of thing, and then everything kind of revolves around that. And sometimes the events that happen in history dictate how my plot is going to go. But I think that there's just something fascinating about the simpler way of life in the past. And so I like to explore that and think, well, how would it be? Like, I love to go and look at, when I go traveling, I love to go to the houses of people, where people used to live, historical figures, and look at all their little things they had, and just imagine how their lives must have been like. Or I love to ask my parents to tell me family stories, or look at old pictures. I don't know. I just find it fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Do you have particular historical periods that you like to explore and write about, or do you just get inspiration from different places? Like, how do you choose the time settings?
Well, I mostly like the 20th century, but I have written about the late 19th century, and that book that I wrote about the late 19th, 20th century came about because of the setting, which was the Galapagos Islands. And not a lot of people know about the human history of the Galapagos, but I had started reading a lot about it, and about people who try to make a life in there, and a lot of tragedies happened to them. And so I was just kind of fascinated by setting, and that's when I picked to write about that period. But usually I'm more interested in, I would say, from the 20s till the 70s and 80s, like all that period I love. And I'm actually writing now something set in the 70s. So
Okay.
yeah.
Just now I've gone down a rabbit hole in my head of at first I was just doing fashion, and then you said 70s, and I was like, oh my gosh, 70s fashion. So many possibilities.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier that there is a sequel to The Spanish Daughter. Can you talk about that at all, or would you rather not?
No, yeah, I can talk a little bit about it. So it's the continuation of the book is set in Colombia in 1925, so 5 years after The Spanish Daughter is over. And there is a backdrop, which is a historical fact. There was an earthquake in the city of Cali, which is in the south of Colombia. And so Puri has to go, and I won't say exactly what, because I don't want to spoil the ending of The Spanish Daughter, but she's trying to find someone. And she has a different disguise this time. And so there is a new cast of characters. There's only about 3 characters or 4 from the first novel. Most of them are new characters. And like I mentioned, there's that Palestinian immigrant family. And there's just some really interesting characters that are going to be in this new story. And it is also has a thread of a mystery in there, where she's trying to has some questions, and it's kind of a similar format, in which you will also see some stuff that happened 14 or 15 years prior to the present story. So That's kind of what I can say about it without giving away too much.
Right. That's always tricky, not wanting to give away, especially with a mystery. You don't want to give too much away.
And time for the final break of the podcast. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Lorena Hughes. Before the break, we were talking about the sequel to The Spanish Daughter, and so we are picking up the conversation after that topic, just so you have a little bit more of a segue as we go back to the interview.
Do you have a time frame for when that book will be out?
I think it's going to be out in 2023, probably in the fall of 2023.
Okay. All right. Any other writings that you would like to highlight? Obviously, we talked about the Sisters of Alameda Street when you were on the podcast last time, but any other writings that you want to talk about?
Well, I'm working on some projects, but those haven't been, they're still a little early in the process. So not yet, I'm still I'm working on 2 different novels, and I'm trying to decide which one I'm gonna present to my agent.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I don't have anything else yet that is ready.
Not a problem. Totally understandable. You obviously do a lot of reading in terms of research, but what have you been reading just for you lately?
So I just finished a book by Silvia Morena Garcia called Signal to Noise, which I think was her debut novel. And the reason I wanted to read that one was because it's set in Mexico City in the 80s. And it also has a present timeline, which actually her present is like 2009 or something like that. But I loved it because I grew up around the same time as this character. I'm a little younger than her main character, but I grew up around the same time. And she has so many references of the music that we used to listen to at the time. And I was like, oh, I love this song too. But I really like that one. And I'm currently reading and not finished yet with The Plot. I don't know if you've heard of that one. It's a thriller type.
I don't think I have.
Thriller. The author is called Jean Han Corlitz. I don't want to mispronounce her name, but it's really good.
Okay.
And it's about a writer, and so it's really interesting, and it has a lot of insight about the writing life, but he is a character as well in the book, so it's really good. I'm enjoying it a lot, and I think I'm going to be done in the next couple of days.
All right. Changing the subject slightly, but does this book, the Spanish Daughter and or the Sisters of Alameda Street, have an audiobook?
Yes, they both do.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yes.
Excellent. I know you have a website, so if you can tell people how to find your website as well as any social media that you are active on.
Okay, so my website is www.lorena-hughes.com. And then I recently opened Instagram, and it's Lorena Hughes Author. My Twitter is @Sister Lorena, and my Facebook is Lorena Hughes Author.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've talked about a few different things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to highlight, whether in terms of the Spanish Daughter or writing in general, anything that we haven't touched on?
A constant theme of my writing, it always has to do with women who struggle for opportunities that are usually denied to them because of their genre and their milieu. So that's kind of a constant in my books, as well as, all this family secrets and the setting of Latin America.
And actually, you mentioned something that I was thinking about earlier in terms of our conversation, was that yes, your characters, you always have complex female characters, but then they also have maybe not no they tend to have complex family relationships as well, and so that plays into at least the two books that I've read that we've talked about. I've really appreciated the complexity of not only the characters but also of their family lives.
Yeah, I the more I talk to people, the more I realize that all families are complicated and all families have secrets and disagreements, and I think that resonates with people a lot because everybody has got, everybody goes through things like this. So that's why I'm also fascinated with those kinds of stories.
And hopefully we don't all have to try to figure out if somebody in our family is trying to kill us, but we do all have secrets in our families that we're trying to navigate.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
And thank you again to Lorena for joining me to talk about The Spanish Daughter. And again, I'll say it's always enjoyable to have her on the podcast. I still can't believe it was episode 38 when she was here the first time. That is crazy, much crazier, or much longer ago than I thought it was. It's actually been almost 5 years since she was on the podcast, which is crazy since I've only been doing this podcast for, like 2 years. I never remember how long I've actually been doing the podcast. It doesn't seem as long as it has been. I think that's a good thing. Anyway, thank you to Lorena. If you like historical fiction, if you are interested in this particular time period, the 1920s, if you're interested in intrigue and mystery and family drama and a woman taking on the persona of her husband in order to navigate this world and try to solve the mystery that she has inadvertently become embroiled in, then you should definitely check out The Spanish Daughter. It is well worth your time, and just it's a good read. And there's a sequel, so what more can you ask for? You're not only going to get one book if you enjoy it. There's going to be a sequel, so I love that. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. I hope that you will join me for the next episode when I will be speaking with author Emily Newmark. It is another mystery. This is set in modern day, not historical fiction though. So hope you'll join me for that book. Lots more intrigue. Strong female character, used to be a cop, is now a private detective. So we've encountered that trope before, but it's told from multiple points of view, so you get her character as well as one of the women that is embroiled in the mystery. So join me for that conversation with Amelia on the next episode. And of course, if you are a fan of this podcast, please do like, subscribe, follow so that you get the episodes as soon as they come out. Also, leave a review, please, if you have not done so already. Star written, whatever, helps us to get the podcast out to lots more listeners. And I would be very, very appreciated if you would take that time to do that for me. Also, follow on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Love to hear from readers. Hit me up, tell me what you're reading or listening to or want to read, or etc. All those good things. I am very nosy about what people are reading and who your favorite authors are, all of those good things. So come find me on social media and we'll chat. Hope you're having a great day. Hope that you have some fun weekend plans, whatever those might be. I don't think we have anything crazy planned this weekend. We're just hanging out. Going to continue to get better and get this voice back on track, hopefully. The voice is less important as getting all the gunk cleared out of my lungs, but I won't share those details with you. Hope you have a great weekend. Of course, I hope that weekend affords you plenty of time to get yourself lost in as many good books as you can stand up to. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.